My alternative title to this video is 10 Things I Hate About Shrews, which I think is very funny because we're here to talk today about shrew taming narratives in early modern English literature, including the most famous of them, Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew, which is the basis for the rom-com 10 Things I Hate About You. Except instead of giving us whatever the early modern equivalent would be of 90s Heath Ledger serenading a Sylvia Plath reading Bad Girl with a rendition of Can't Take My Eyes Off of You, Shakespeare's play gives us a man psychologically torturing his wife into submission, which is like not quite as fun. And you probably already knew that, but what you might not know is that shortly after the first performances of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, a play emerged titled Taming of A Shrew with no listed author and almost the exact same plot, and that then in 1611, a play called The Woman's Prize or The Tamer Tamed was written by John Fletcher as a sequel to Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. So to put this in terms that make you want to click on a YouTube video, we have Shakespeare's play, then we have a bootleg, and then we have an unauthorized sequel. By the way, hi, my name is Carson. I have a PhD in English and I'm using it to make hour-long videos about centuries-old literature. Every new person who subscribes to this channel is responsible for the fact that my videos just keep getting longer and my subjects just keep getting more specific. One of these days, you're gonna log on to YouTube and you're gonna find out that I've posted a 3-hour-long video about butt jokes in English Civil War broadsides, and you'll have no one to blame for that but yourselves. But today, as I said, we're talking about shrew taming narratives, including Shakespeare's, which I have here in this conveniently sized little single playbook, so small that I could just squeeze it in my fist into a little ball and throw it out the window or into the trash, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Shakespeare didn't invent the idea of shrew taming. Taming of the Shrew is just one entry in a long, proud line of narratives celebrating the squashing of a woman's spirit. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to walk through the plots of Shakespeare's The Shrew, the anonymous A Shrew, and Fletcher's Tamer Tamed. We're going to talk a bit about what these plays are saying about gender and violence, and we're going to end up taking some digressions into early modern dramatic practice. And I'm going to try not to get distracted by fringe authorship theories or by the deep sense of injustice and rage that takes over me when I think about the ending of Shakespeare's Shrew. I might fail on both those counts. Let's start by getting on the same page about what a shrew is. Other than a tiny animal with a wiggly little nose and a venomous bite, fun fact. Is a shrew just a Shakespearean version of the sitcom trope of a nagging wife? A slightly mean, very opinionated woman who won't let her husband have any fun? Yeah, sometimes, kind of mostly, but things are never really that simple, are they? And we are not here on this page to talk about things in a simple way. We're here to dive into a lot of historical contextualization, so let's get into it, shall we? In a chapter in a book about gender and power in shrew taming narratives, which is titled Gender and Power in Shrew Taming Narratives, 1500 to 1700, Holly Crocker digs into the usage of the word shrew, going back to medieval texts to show how shrew was not always necessarily used to describe a woman. Chaucer's wife of Bath characterizes her husbands as shrews. Public figures, men involved in governance, could be described as shrewish. Treatises framed at being from fathers to sons had sections aimed at preventing shrewish behavior. And in a chapter in the same book, Richard Madeline talks about how shrew could be used to describe both men and women, not just in medieval usage, but still in Shakespeare's day, even though by that point it was less common. Shrewish was basically a descriptor of unruly and violent behavior, usually in a comic register. A shrew in early modern English literature was someone who was displaying violent bad behavior that we are laughing about, and usually it's a disobedient wife. And you see shrew taming narratives, stories where a disobedient, angry wife has her behavior corrected in a few different places throughout early modern English literary record. Obviously plays, also jesting literature, basically joke books, and ballads, broadside ballads. Broadside ballads were songs that were set to popular stock tunes and printed on these big sheets of paper to be disseminated, sold, sung. Often they were ways of disseminating news or propaganda, but sometimes they were just ways of telling stories, like a story about shrew taming. And what you'll notice is that these are forms of popular media, jesting literature, plays, ballads, that aren't exactly made to grapple with the complexities and the heaviness of domestic violence, which is what is at the heart of shrew taming narratives. The shrew is not being tamed through a heartfelt and vulnerable conversation about whether she feels her needs are being met in her marriage. In this video, through talking about these 3 different plays, I'm going to be talking about plots that include depictions of physical, emotional, and sexual violence. And these acts of violence are played for laughs. And that's part of what we have to talk about when we're talking about them. We're going to start by talking about Shakespeare's The Shrew, and before we start getting into the plot, I have a question for you. If you have seen this play before, I want you to think back and try to remember if the play began with a drunk dude passing out on the street and a bunch of rich dudes playing a prank on him. Because a lot of productions leave that part out. A lot of people don't realize that this whole thing is a play within a play. Before we get to Act 1, Scene 1, we get what is called the induction, in which we meet a very drunk, poor man named Christopher Sly, who passes out in the street. A wealthy man finds Christopher Sly passed out there, and he decides it would be funny if he tricks Christopher Sly into thinking that he is a lord who has been sick and forgotten that he was wealthy and important. And so when he wakes up from being passed out in the street, he's surrounded by finery and servants, and they're all telling him, "Oh my God, you're awake, you're lucid again. Would you like to be entertained? Let us put on a play to entertain you." And the play that is performed to entertain this dude as part of a prank is Taming of the Shrew. There are several subplots in this play, but I'm just going to give a refresher on the shrew taming element of the plot. Our premise is that there is a wealthy man named Baptista Minola, and he has 2 daughters. His younger daughter, Bianca, is beautiful and sweet, and lots of people want to marry her, but he has decided that she can't get married until his older daughter, Catherine, is married. The problem there is that while Catherine, or Kate, is also very beautiful, she is a shrew. She is mean, she is contrarian, and all the guys are afraid of her. One of Bianca's suitors meets up with his friend, Petruchio, who has decided that he is ready to get married. And Bianca's suitor says, "I have a great idea. Why don't you marry Catherine so I can marry Bianca?" And Petruchio says, "Yeah, that sounds like fun." Now, the Wikipedia plot summary of what happens next is that Catherine and Petruchio meet, and that after their conversation, quote, "Catherine agrees to marry Petruchio after seeing he is the only man willing to counter her quick remarks." This is a pretty common way to present the story, that Catherine is acerbic and bored of all these guys who just can't keep up with her, but she's able to spar with Petruchio in a way that she finds satisfying and exciting, and so she agrees to marry him. And it is true that their initial conversation has some really entertaining, lightning-quick banter, and that at the end of this conversation, their marriage is agreed on. Unfortunately, Catherine is not one of the people agreeing. The marriage is agreed upon between her father and Petruchio, and she never verbally assents. Now, it is true that in Shakespeare and in other early modern English drama, we have very little to work with other than dialogue. There are very few stage directions, very rarely any indication of what props are intended to be used, and there is never indication of how a line should be delivered other than whatever context we can get from how other people verbally react to it. And so a lot of the tone of a piece of dialogue, a scene, even a play as a whole, is genuinely up for interpretation. Honestly, I think that's part of what makes these plays so interesting, is that there's so many different ways you can reinterpret different lines and scenes and plays in a way that is fresh and interpretive, but still true to the text. And so in this initial conversation scene between Petruchio and Catherine, an actor or a director can decide whether Catherine should be physically indicating flirtatiousness and humor and interest in Petruchio, or whether she should be performing frustration and discomfort and resistance, or even fear. If you haven't before, you should watch some clips from the 1978 production of this play with Raul Julia and Meryl Streep in it. Theirs is a very flirtatious, very entertaining version of this dynamic. She's playful, he's charming, they're both hot, it's fun to watch. And that's what we want to watch. You know, we want to watch a romantic comedy, a battle of the titans of these 2 equally matched wits who are kind of both irreverent and both playing with each other. And the director and the actors can make that choice. Whoever wrote that sentence in the Wikipedia plot description can say that Catherine chose Petruchio, even though she didn't actually verbally choose him. And Harold Bloom can say that theirs is the happiest marriage in Shakespeare. But when I read the text for that scene, what I see is that all the sexual innuendo comes from Petruchio, never from Catherine, that she slaps him for his continued persistent flirtation in the face of her rejections, and that, most importantly, again, she never verbally indicates agreement to the marriage. In fact, she says she's being forced to give her hand. On their wedding day, she says, "I must forsooth be forced to give my hand opposed against my heart." Now, to play devil's advocate against myself here, I guess, she is saying this when he is late in arriving. And so sometimes this is portrayed as her being upset that he isn't there yet because she thinks she's being stood up and left at the altar by a man who she actually does want to marry. And that later in that scene, when she exits weeping, she's again weeping because she really does want to marry Petruchio. Him arriving late to the wedding is the beginning of his taming strategy. He starts off by humiliating her. He shows up late for the wedding, he acts ridiculous at it, and he won't let her stay for her own wedding feast. He makes them go to his house immediately. Here are some of the things he does once they are at his house. He yells at and physically abuses his servants in front of her and won't let her intervene on their behalf. He withholds food from her. Once she is desperate to eat, he brings some food in and then says, "Oh, actually, you're clearly not interested in eating this," and he throws it away in front of her. He keeps such constant noise going in the house that she is unable to sleep. He brings in a haberdasher under the pretense that he's going to get some new clothes made for his wife, and then every time she says she likes something, he says, "No, that's ugly, and you can't have anything until you're nice to me." They begin traveling back to visit her family because her sister Bianca is going to get married. During their journey, he looks up at the sun and he says, "Wow, the moon is shining so bright tonight." And when she says, "No, that is not the moon, that's the sun," he says, "If you contradict me, I will never let you visit your family again." This is the point at which she gives in and the taming is complete. She looks up at the sun and she says, "Oh, you're so right. I'm sorry, my mistake. That is the moon." He says, "That's not the moon, that's the sun." She says, "You're so right, babe. It is the sun." He says, "No, it's not. It's the moon." Fun fact, while I was writing up my notes for this video, I was listening to a lot of music by Shaggy, and I'm pretty sure that this scene is referenced in It Wasn't Me, the reggae pop hit from 2000 by Shaggy featuring Rick Ross. I guess it could be a coincidence. I'm stalling because now I have to talk about the ending of this play. The play ends with a double marriage. Catherine's sister Bianca gets married, and there's another wedding as well between a couple that I haven't mentioned at all. And at the wedding feast, the three recently married men decide to test which of their wives is the most loyal. All the wives are hanging out off stage, having a nice old time, and so the husbands decide that they will summon their wives to their sides, and whoever appears first is the most loyal of the wives. The three wives are summoned, but only Catherine comes. Once they get the other two women out there, Petruchio tells Catherine that as the most obedient wife, she should give a speech educating the other women about how they are meant to behave. And she does. You know what? Actually, I'm gonna put the little guy aside and pull out the big guy. This is the complete works of Shakespeare I got when I was like 15. I think, and in it I wrote a number of notes that I have since erased when I was like 19 or something, which I wish I hadn't done because now it's enough time has gone by that I think they're funny. When I was like 19, I thought they were just embarrassing because they're so, purely youthfully emotional about the plays. Now that I am no longer afraid of cringe, I wish I could look back and read everything that I had written. I erased a lot of it, but this part still remains. This is the final scene in which Catherine is telling the other women what duty they do owe their lords and husbands. And I'm not gonna read the whole speech because I don't wanna, because it makes me mad, but I will say that next to the line, "Thy husband is thy lord, thy life, thy keeper," which I underlined, 15-year-old Carson wrote, "This is the most sexist, ridiculous thing I've ever read." And yeah, when I wrote that in the margins, again, probably like 15, maybe 16 years old, it had been a couple years since I had first read the play. I think I was 13 or 14 when I first read it. It was one of the first Shakespeare plays I ever read. I think the order was Romeo and Juliet, then Midsummer Night's Dream, and then Taming of the Shrew. And when I got to the end of the Taming of the Shrew, I threw my book across the room. It wasn't this book. It was a smaller one. I was just so mad. I thought that Shakespeare was supposed to be this elevated genius and that a genius should be able to see past the prejudices of their own time. I felt so betrayed that this was the happy ending, that this was the way that Catherine's arc ends, because I found her so compelling. There's this one scene midway through the play when Catherine is trying to stand up for herself against Petruchio. And she says to him, "My tongue will tell the anger of my heart, or else my heart concealing it will break, and rather than it shall, I will be free, even to the uttermost, as I please in words." I committed those lines to memory something like 17 years ago, and I still love them. Even though the only interpretation I could see of the ending when I first read it, and honestly the one I still see now, is that in the end, Catherine's heart is broken because she's been forced to conceal her anger. She's no longer free to the uttermost through her words. As you can probably tell, I have a hard time being objective about this play. I have a lot of feelings about it. But mine are only one set of feelings and interpretations about this play. There are other readings. Some people make the argument that while Catherine might be tamed at the end of this play, we get a glimpse of these two other women being now unruly and independent. They don't come when they're called, and they don't chime in and agree with Catherine while she's giving them her little speech. So while the play's ending shows us one marriage of domination, it shows us two with a possibly more equal power dynamic. There's also the question of how Catherine is being presented, not just at the ending, but throughout the course of this play. Is she being framed as just this straightforward bitch, this shrew who is in need of correction, or is she being presented sympathetically? This is a little bit of a digression, but it's my video and I can talk about whatever I want. There's an article that I really love that is making something of a case for the idea that the original performances of the play could have been intentionally directing sympathies towards Catherine. This is an article by Sally Templeman on food, bodies, and in-yard performance spaces in early Shakespearean drama. See, mostly when we think about Shakespeare in original performance, we think about the Globe. But when Taming the Shrew was first performed in the early 1590s, there was no Globe. Shakespeare didn't have yet a home theater. Theater that is home theater, you know what I mean. Sometimes in this period, rather than being performed in a formal theater, plays would be performed in these in-yard performance spaces, yards of inns, basically these courtyards around which was the structure of an inn where people could spend the night and eat a meal. Templeman goes through some historical evidence and makes a case for the idea that two of Shakespeare's earliest plays, Titus and Taming, might have been performed in these in-yard spaces. And that while audiences were watching these performances of Titus and Taming, both of which have some pretty important food-related scenes, they would have also been smelling the food being cooked in the kitchens that were right next to them. Let's not get distracted by thinking about what that means for Titus. But in Taming, Templeman suggests that the onstage scene of appetite would have been the one where Petruchio is withholding food from Catherine. He's kind of waving it in front of her and saying, "Do you want it? Well, you can't have it." And that while that is happening, the audience's own appetites are building as they are smelling the aromas of the food cooking nearby. Templeman's suggestion is that this creates the possibility for a slippage between onstage and offstage appetites. She says, "By the time that Petruchio prevents Kate from eating mutton, claiming that 'tis burnt and so is all the meat, playgoers are well aware that his behavior is part of his plan to cure his wife of her shrewishness. Under normal circumstances, we would expect many an early modern playgoer to have supported Petruchio's shrew-curing burnt meat ploy. However, the support may have waned when playgoers were themselves hungry and, like Kate, were being taunted by the aroma of cooked food. Seduced by the inn's smellscape, an onstage-offstage desire for food may have nudged playgoers' sympathies away from Petruchio the shrew tamer and towards the hungry shrew. Empathy for Kate's hunger, though not necessarily her shrewish disposition, may have been urged upon the audience by their own starveling bodies. In addition, a mutual hunger potentially aligned in-yard playgoers of both sexes with Kate because, like her, Petruchio's antics were keeping them hungry and would continue to do so until the play concluded and they could consume their post-performance supper. Part of the reason I love this article is that I just think it's really cool how it sketches out so much detail about the spaces and the practices and the embodied realities of late 16th century life and theatrical performance, and help me to imagine myself into that world, that experience. And also because it helps me imagine audiences feeling sympathetic towards Catherine's plight, even if many of them may have applauded her submission speech at the end. Speaking of the end, did you notice what's missing? It's the close of the frame narrative. We never pick back up with the Christopher Sly plot. And for that reason, and a couple other factors as well, there's some doubt as to where this version of the play came from. Is it one of Shakespeare's rough drafts for Taming of the Shrew? Is it just a sloppy printing error? Part of the complication in deciphering where this version of the play comes from is that printing drama in early modern England was not exactly straightforward. You might think that the text of a play would be published right when the play is first being performed. But in early modern England, plays were sometimes performed without ever being published at all, or sometimes not published for years after their initial performances. And that's the case with Taming of the Shrew. As a quick matter of research, methodology, transparency, I pull all my data on first publications and first performances from the database of early English playbooks, which is an amazing free online resource. DEEP for short. DEEP lists Taming of the Shrew as having been first performed probably in 1592, although possibly as early as 1590 or 91. But the play was never published until the first folio, the first collection of all Shakespeare's works, was put together, and that happened when, say it with me everyone, 1623. And Shakespeare died when? That's right, 1616. Are we having fun? Is this a fun video? The topic, it's fun, you're having a good time, right? Yeah. So the fact that Taming of the Shrew was never published until so many years after Shakespeare's death contributes to the amount of questions surrounding where this version of the play came from. I'm not going to be able to give an answer as to where exactly this version of the play comes from or why, again, it seems to be missing a piece at the end. All I can do is draw our attention to how complicated it is to read a play like Taming of the Shrew, and how things only become even more complicated and interesting when we bring in the taming of A Shrew. Now, with A Shrew, again, I'm pulling from DEEP here, the proposed first performance date is 1592. And yes, that is maybe the same year as Shakespeare's The Shrew, although again, that may have been as early as 90 or 91. But the general consensus is that even if they were first both performed in 92, Shakespeare's Shrew came first. First in performance, not first in publication, because the anonymous Shrew was first published in 1594. Many theories yet again have been advanced about this play. Was A Shrew an earlier draft of The Shrew? Were Shakespeare and the anonymous author of A Shrew possibly both working off of the same original source material? Are both of the Shrew plays part of an elaborate riddle which, if you can solve, will point you to the truth about how Christopher Marlowe faked his own death in 1593 to go into hiding and write all of the plays that we now consider to be Shakespeare's? No. I referred to the anonymous Shrew earlier in this video as a bootleg version, and early modern bootleg plays kind of did exist. People would try to scrawl down shorthand transcripts of plays during and after the performance to try to be able to reproduce them in performance or publication to get some money. Maybe that's what's going on in this play. Maybe this is a partially transcribed, partially from memory version of Shakespeare's play. We can't know for sure, but we can put these plays next to each other as two items of evidence that help us consider what kinds of stories are being told about shrews, about disobedient wives and gendered violence in early modern English drama. The basic structure of the anonymous Shrew is the same as Shakespeare's Shrew. No one can marry the virtuous younger daughter until the older daughter is married, and so a man marries Kate the Shrew and tames her into submission. But there are also a number of differences, ranging from the superficial to the substantial. For one thing, the names. Kate's remains the same, but the other names are changed. Her husband is now Ferrando, her father is now Alfonso, she has 2 sisters instead of just 1. But the more substantial differences are really interesting to look at, and one of them happens in that first conversation between Kate and Ferrando. With Shakespeare's Kate and Petruchio, we had, again, no verbal agreement to marriage. But in the conversation between Kate and Ferrando in the anonymous shrew, she does explicitly agree to marry him. Here's what she says. "Why, father, what do you mean to do with me? To give me thus unto this brain-sick man that in his mood cares not to murder me? But yet I will consent and marry him, for I methinks have lived too long a maid." So in this version, I think it's much more plausible to read a flirtatious and kind of mutually playful dynamic into that central relationship. Unfortunately, we do still have the withholding of food, the taunting with clothes, the beating of the servants, and the denial of sleep. And the ending is also functionally the same, but with one moment that I really like. There's this one exchange of dialogue at that final wedding scene. That's very fun. Kate gives her whole speech at the wedding, obey your husband, blah, blah, blah. And after the speech, Kate's sister's new husband is looking at his new wife and he's saying, "Why do you not obey me like your sister obeys her husband?" He says to his wife, "I say thou art a shrew." And she says, "That's better than a sheep." It's such a good retort, and I will be coming back to it later in this video at length. If you're still here, please don't leave me alone with these plays. Another way that the anonymous shrew really interestingly diverges from Shakespeare's is the function of the frame narrative. We still have Christopher Sly, but we have a lot more of him. In Shakespeare's version, there's that induction. The rich man tricks the poor Christopher Sly into thinking that he is a nobleman being entertained with a play, and then we never see or hear from Sly again. In the anonymous shrew, we open with Christopher Sly passed out, the whole prank, blah, 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 a play for your entertainment. And then Christopher Sly stays on stage the whole time and he talks over the course of the play. Sometimes it's just to ask his servants to bring him more to drink, but sometimes he also comments on the plot of the Taming of a Shrew that is playing out in front of him. He likes it when this one particular character is on stage. He gets worried when it seems like these 2 other characters are going to be sent to prison. And at the end, the frame is closed. Christopher Sly passes out again and the pranksters return him to his poor person clothes and leave him back in the street where they found him. He wakes up thinking that he just had a very vivid dream. And his takeaway from that dream is, "I know now how to tame a shrew. I dreamt upon it all this night till now, and thou hast waked me out of the best dream that I ever had in my life. But I'll to my wife presently and tame her too, and if she angers me." This is such a fucking bummer because it suggests what is, to me, the worst possible function of a shrew taming narrative, which is not just that it normalizes domestic violence, but that it is an instructional tool for domestic violence. That a man will read a joke or listen to a ballad or watch a play about a Ferrando taming Kate or Petruchio taming Kate, and he will get ideas from that on how he can go home and abuse his wife. In my continued efforts to present a balanced range of perspectives on how we can read these texts and understand them in their original performance contexts, we can take into consideration what it means that these lines are coming from Christopher Sly, who is a foolish character. He's a drunken idiot, and throughout the entire play, we have been laughing at him, never with him. So does that apply to these ending lines? Is his desire to go home and tame his wife just another thing that we laugh at rather than with? Is this another piece of evidence for him being an idiot? When we're reading a 400-year-old play, it's hard to know what certain jokes or messages or characters would have meant to original audiences. How would people have reacted to original performances of The Anonymous Shrew or of Shakespeare's Shrew? In a chapter they co-wrote, Anna Bayman and George Southcombe say that While Catherine's final speech in The Taming of the Shrew encodes a powerful message of patriarchal dominance, there is no reason to assume that all of his audience would have wholly accepted this. When I think about this, I compare it to how if somebody 400 years from now was reading a transcript of a misogynistic stand-up comedy set, it wouldn't be fair for that future reader to assume that everyone in the audience would have accepted the content of that comedy set, or that this comedy set is reflective of our society as a whole today. The early modern playwright John Fletcher certainly seems not to have accepted the message of patriarchal dominance in the ending of Shakespeare's Shrew, or at least to have noticed that enough other people were dissatisfied with the ending that it provided him with the opportunity for a rebuttal. Because he wrote a play, the entire purpose of which is to punish Petruchio. I only learned about this play like a year ago, but I think that it should always be taught, or at least always be mentioned, alongside Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. It's called The Woman's Prize, or The Tamer Tamed. As I said, written by John Fletcher, and it was first performed in 1611, quite a while after the first performances of The Shrew and A Shrew. And when I say that this play was written to punish Petruchio, when I called it at the beginning of this video an unauthorized sequel to Shakespeare's play, I'm not taking creative liberties. This is explicitly a sequel to Taming of the Shrew. We pick up at the beginning of Tamer Tamed an unspecified amount of time after the close of action of Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. Catherine has died, and Petruchio is remarrying. And this play is again presenting Petruchio as domineering, as controlling, as wanting to make his wife submissive to him, but it's also explicitly criticizing him for this and presenting him as excessive in his shrew taming ways. His mistreatment of women has been excessive, and he is the one who needs to be corrected. I'm going to return to Holly Crocker, who I referenced at the beginning of the video for her discussion on the gendering of the term shrew. As you'll remember, shrew could be applied to both man and woman. The ambivalent gendering was more common in medieval usage. By the early modern period, it was more commonly used to be describing a woman, and even when describing a man, Crocker says, the term is feminized. From comic literature to domestic discourse to household drama, men who fail to display rationality in their exercises of governance forfeit their presumption to wield masculine authority, becoming male shrews through feminized displays of frenzied misrule. By acting like ungoverned women, male shrews lose all positive gender associations, either with masculine reason or with feminine knowledge. This, she says, is what happened to Petruchio. He went too far, his taming was unruly and irrational. As Crocker says, Fletcher's play, Tamer Tamed, opens with the possibility that Petruchio tamed Catherine to death. And so what this play is now going to give us is an alternative taming narrative. Because like Catherine, Petruchio's new wife, Maria, refuses to submit to her husband. But unlike Catherine, Maria has allies, and she has a plan. She starts off by just refusing to consummate the marriage. She's not gonna fuck him. And this decision gets a bunch of other women to rally to her cause. They are singing, they are celebrating that Maria has barred Petruchio from her bed, they are defending her to the other men. After a while of this, one of Petruchio's friends says to him, well, did you try using violence? Quote, some women love to struggle. Petruchio says, yes, I did try using violence. I don't need to do my personal commentary on how fucked up this part is and how much I hate it, right? Let's just heave a deep sigh together. Feel the rage. And then I can move on to more analytically discussing the next part of this. So the next bit is the part where Petruchio describes Maria's response. She swore my force might weary her, but win her I never could nor should till she consented, and I might take her body prisoner, but for her mind or appetite. Maria is being presented as morally and logically correct. Petruchio is the one who is unreasonable and excessive. Like Crocker is saying, he is the shrewish one. Him committing assault is an example of unruly behavior that Maria needs to correct. Her next corrective strategy, and this might have been my favorite part of the play, is to tell everyone that he has the plague. So she is emptying everything and everyone out of the house. She's boarding it up. She's calling the plague doctors. Petruchio is going absolutely insane, telling everyone, insisting, I'm not sick. And Maria is just going, oh, my poor almost dead husband. Eventually, he reaches his wit's end and Petruchio fakes his own death in the hopes that Maria will be moved to regret and he will have taught her a lesson. Everyone is standing around the coffin and Petruchio's friends turn to Maria and they say, look at your dead husband. Don't you feel sad now? And she says, yes, I'm very sad. Sad that he was such an idiot. Sad that he wasted his life. She says she weeps to think how simple, how far below a man, how far from reason, from common understanding and all gentry while he was living, here he walked amongst us. And she says that if he had lived for longer, he only would have been going around being an idiot for longer. And at this, Petruchio kind of jumps up and he's like, what the hell? And Maria says, okay, I'm done now. I went through all my plans. I've done my worst. I have beat you at every step of your own game. I feel you have been sufficiently tamed. And now I will be your servant. It's still an early modern play, you know? If she's gonna survive it, she has to submit to her husband at the end. That's just the narrative rule. But after she has submitted to her husband, we get this epilogue. The tamer tamed, but so as nor the men can find one just cause to complain of when they fitly do consider in their lives they should not reign as tyrants o'er their wives. Nor can the women from this precedent insult or triumph, it being aptly meant, to teach both sexes due equality, and as they stand bound to love mutually. If this effect arising from a cause well laid and grounding may deserve applause, we something more than hope our honest ends will keep the men and women too our friends. It's an endorsement of companionate marriage, and a request that the audience will please clap. And you know what? I will clap at that. I will clap for an early modern endorsement of companionate marriage. Sometimes when I talk online about misogynistic characters or texts or ideas from early modern English literature, I will get responses that are basically, well, yeah, everyone was a misogynist back then. And it is true, of course, that the social structures and the political and cultural systems of early modern England were restrictive and often dangerous for women. And it's possible that even the most forward-thinking person alive in Shakespeare's England would be a misogynist by my standards if I met them today. But to my view, if you write off early modern England as a time when just everyone was a misogynist, you're letting the Petruchios off the hook. You're saying that's just how things were back then. People didn't give it a second thought. Nobody realized it was wrong to abuse their wives. Well, really, even though there were an abundance of shrew taming narratives, there were people looking at those narratives and saying, that's not a happy ending. There were audiences who wanted to be entertained by a story of a woman beating a shrew tamer at his own game. And this is not to say that Fletcher's play was feminist or that things were fine for women in Shakespeare's time, actually. It's just that if you paint over the past with too broad a brush, you're gonna end up covering up a lot of interesting stuff. Emotionally, if you couldn't tell, I hate Taming of the Shrew. Historically and academically, I find it really fascinating. Honestly, I think that this might be one of the texts that was most formative for me in deciding that I wanted to pursue the study of literature. For better or for worse, this is kind of the way it goes for me a lot of the time. The literary texts and the subjects that I find most compelling and interesting are the ones that kind of piss me off a little bit. I want a little bit of a fight, you know? It's things like this that make me go, oh, I'm so mad. You know what I'm gonna do about it? Research. I'm gonna research about it. And then I'm gonna talk about it for, I don't even know how long. How long has it been? How long have we been here? Are you still here? At some point in this video, I quoted a couple lines out of the anonymous shrew, where a man tells his wife, you're a shrew, and she says, that's better than a sheep. See, I told you I was coming back to that. Much like Shakespeare's play is just one entry into a whole genre of shrew taming narratives, this comment is just one example of a popular topic of debate. Is it better to marry a shrew or a sheep? The shrew versus sheep dichotomy pops up in a bunch of different areas in early modern English discourse. There's one mid-16th century husbandry guide that presents a dialogue of two people debating this subject. Do you want to marry a shrew or a sheep? A woman who is vitriolic and unruly, or one who is totally submissive and reserved? If you had to choose on these extremes of behavior. Which extreme is better? An argument is made for both, and as far as I read it, it didn't really come down solidly on one side or the other, but the argument made in favor of a shrew making a better wife than a sheep is that a shrew will actually help her husband to thrive. A woman who is too passive won't really be successful at managing a household, whereas a woman who's really assertive and, a little mean will get stuff done. One scholar named Pamela Allen Brown wrote a whole book about this topic of discourse, and it is called Better a Shrew Than a Sheep. She is focusing in this book about how women participated in jesting culture. And she's focusing on ordinary women, not noble women, not writers, just the women who were going about attending plays, making jokes, living their lives. The kind of women who tend to be left out of the historical record and get overlooked in scholarship. And she looks at women's laughter, women's jokes, women's use of the comeback, like the woman at the end of A Shrew, who when told she is a shrew, says it's better than a sheep. She says in this book that acknowledging that real women took part in the culture of jesting points to their cultural competence in unlooked for arenas. They could use a jest or a ballad to answer attacks on women or to launch their own criticisms of men. Some women may have been chaste, silent, and obedient, but others left traces of their audible, visible, irreverent performances in records and representations of everyday social spaces. And a little bit later on in the book, she says, because jesting literature was accessible to women, drew on their skills, and courted their pleasure, even the homely retort, better a shrew than a sheep, may have functioned as one of the oppositional practices of everyday life, a means for ordinary people to contest social practices that ordain them as subordinates. As I've been saying kind of over and over again throughout this video, we can't know exactly how certain texts, certain characters, certain themes would have been received by original audiences. And a lot of the ways that people would have registered their unhappiness with the way things were in their world wouldn't necessarily survive in the historical record. The way people were talking as they walked out of the theater, the way people were arguing amongst their friends and their partners and other audience members. We don't know how those things played out. We never will until I get that time machine built. We'll never know whether there were people grumbling or booing in the audience during Catherine's final speech in Taming of the Shrew, or whether there were men actually using Petruchio's abuse as a model for their own, or whether there were women walking out feeling defeated by seeing yet another misogynistic shrew taming narrative play out, or whether there was a 15-year-old who bought a copy of Taming of the Shrew and wrote in her margins, like I did, whatever the early modern equivalent would be of this is the most sexist garbage thing I've ever read. But through looking closely at what does survive in the historical record, through looking at scholarship or doing scholarship, like Pamela Allen Brown's, we can find these traces of reactions and rejections and these ordinary ways that people were pushing back against the idea of shrew taming. And we can imagine, I can imagine a man in the audience of the Taming of the Shrew at an in-yard performance seeing that Catherine is hungry and feeling that he is hungry and smelling the food cooking nearby and having a moment of kinship with her. If I can imagine a Christopher Sly type watching Taming of the Shrew and taking it as instructional material, I can also imagine a woman in the audience of the Tamer Tamed taking that as instructional material. I also like to imagine having one of those dream dinner parties where you can invite anyone, dead or alive, and I invite Shakespeare and then a bunch of women writers, and we withhold food from him, and we argue with him about this play until he apologizes, and he has to really mean it, or else I'm never gonna let him have one of the frozen margs the rest of us are drinking. No frozen margs for Shakespeare until he says sorry. And also, possibly more realistically, I can imagine all the women in the audience of Shakespeare's Shrew or the anonymous Shrew or any other shrew taming narrative of the time walking out, rolling their eyes, and saying to their friends, well, better a shrew than a sheep. That's the end of the video. I'm gonna have a frozen margarita. You're just too good to be shrew. Can't take my eyes off of you. Fuck this play.